The day Georgia Winslow stopped laughing was the same day they buried her husband in the hard red dirt of Caldwell, Kansas. And for 3 years after that, the silence lived inside her like a second skeleton. That was the truth of it, plain and unadorned as the black dress she still wore when the mood struck her, which was most mornings. Because most mornings she woke up, and the first thing she remembered was that Samuel was gone, and the second thing she remembered was that the bank held a lien on the last 40 acres of the Winslow property. And the third thing she remembered was that she had a daughter named Clara who was 7 years old and needed feeding and schooling, and a mother who was present in her own life. So Georgia Winslow would pull herself upright against the iron headboard, plant her bare feet on the cold pine floor, and begin the business of surviving another day in the Kansas Territory in the autumn of 1879. Caldwell was a cattle town, situated right up against the border of Indian Territory, and it moved with the energy of a place that was always on the edge of something. Drovers came through with longhorn herds heading north from Texas, and with them came trail dust and money and noise and men who had been on horseback for 3 months and wanted to spend everything they had earned in one spectacular evening. The saloons obliged them. The merchants obliged them. The whole town had a kind of feverish, temporary quality to it, like a fire that burned bright because the wood was green and wouldn't last. Georgia ran the mercantile that had belonged to Samuel's father before Samuel inherited it. She kept the ledgers in her own hand, ordered the dry goods and the hardware and the medicine from suppliers in Wichita, and she did it all with a composure that the other women in Caldwell respected and quietly found a little frightening. She was 28 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned severely at the back of her head, and green eyes that had once been quick with amusement but had gone still the way a river goes still before a freeze. She was not unkind. She was not unfriendly. She answered questions and filled orders and said good morning and good afternoon, and helped old Mrs. Packard find the right grade of flannel for a winter quilt. She simply did not laugh. She had forgotten, somewhere in the long gray corridor of grief, what it felt like to think something was genuinely funny, and she had stopped trying to find out. Clara was a different creature entirely. Clara laughed at everything. She laughed at the rooster that lived behind the livery and crowed at all the wrong hours. She laughed at her own drawings, which were wild and colorful and bore no particular resemblance to anything in the known world. She laughed when she dropped things, and when the cat knocked things off the counter, and when the wind blew her hair sideways. Georgia watched her daughter laugh and felt something that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but lived uncomfortably between them. A longing so specific it had its own shape, like an empty chair at a table set for dinner. Thomas Hudson rode into Caldwell on the 3rd Thursday of October, 1879, which happened to be the day the first serious cold front of the season pushed down from the north and turned the sky the color of a pewter plate. He came in from the south, trailing a small remuda of horses he was delivering to a rancher named Elias Voss, who had a spread 10 miles east of town. He was 31 years old, 6 feet and a fraction of an inch, with a lean, weather-darkened face and dark brown eyes that had a quality of paying close attention to things that other people's eyes slid past. He wore a battered hat the color of old tobacco and a canvas duster that had seen serious weather, and he sat his horse the way men do when they have spent more years in the saddle than out of it, easy and permanent, as though the horse were simply an extension of the ground beneath him. He delivered the horses to Elias Voss and collected his pay, and then rode back into town because he needed grain for his own horse, a big gray gelding named Abbott who had an appetite that outpaced his dignity considerably, and he needed a few supplies before he headed back south toward the Texas Panhandle, where his next job was waiting. He tied Abbott to the post outside the Winslow Mercantile and pushed through the door, and the bell above it rang, and Georgia looked up from the ledger she was balancing on the counter and took in the sight of a trail-dusted cowboy the way she took in the sight of most trail-dusted cowboys, which was to say she noted his presence and waited to hear what he needed. "Afternoon," Thomas said, pulling off his hat. His hair was dark and needed cutting. "Afternoon," Georgia said. "What can I help you with?" He produced a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket and smoothed it on the counter between them. It was a modest list. Grain for the horse, coffee, salt pork, a pound of dried beans, a new canteen strap because his old one had finally given up its integrity somewhere north of the Red River. Georgia moved around the store efficiently, pulling things from shelves and stacking them on the counter. Thomas watched her work without being obvious about it, which was a skill he had developed over years of being in environments where watching too openly got a man into trouble. He noticed the way she moved, precise and economical, and he noticed the quality of the silence around her, which was not a comfortable quiet but a defended one, the kind that had been constructed deliberately. "You passing through?" He asked because it was a reasonable question, and he was a man who believed that conversations were worth having even with strangers. "I live here," Georgia said, setting the canteen strap on the counter. "I own this store." "I meant me," Thomas said. "You look like you were about to ask if I was passing through." Georgia looked at him then directly, and he saw the green eyes that had been closed and measured and carefully blank, and something in them shifted slightly, just at the edges, like a door that doesn't open but whose latch moves. "Are you passing through?" "I am," he said. "Heading back to Texas. Got a job waiting near Tascosa." She tallied his items and told him the total, and he paid in exact coin, which she appreciated because making change for large bills in late afternoon, when her concentration was already frayed by numbers, was one of the minor irritants of the trade. He thanked her and gathered his things and walked out, and the bell rang again, and Georgia looked back at her ledger. She did not think about him specifically. She thought about the total in the column and whether it balanced, and it did barely, by 43 cents, which was close enough to give her a mild, tired satisfaction. Thomas had been gone for an hour when the trouble started. It began, as trouble in cattle towns often did, with a group of drovers who had been paid off and had been working through their wages at the Long Branch Saloon 2 doors down, and who had developed among themselves a disagreement about something that had happened somewhere on the trail between Texas and Kansas, a disagreement that had been marinating in whiskey for 3 hours and was now ready to boil over. 2 of them spilled out onto the main street in a condition that was somewhere between fighting and falling, and the larger of the 2, a red-faced man built like a feed barrel, went through the front window of the mercantile with a force that suggested he had received some assistance from the smaller man behind him. The window exploded inward. Georgia had been in the back storeroom checking inventory when she heard it, a detonation of glass, and she came through the curtain fast and found a large man sitting in the ruins of her display window, bleeding from several places and looking genuinely confused, surrounded by a scatter of dry goods that had been on the shelf below the window sill. "Get out of my store," Georgia said. Her voice was absolutely steady. The man blinked at her. "Ma'am, I am terribly sorry. I did not intend to." "Get out of my store," she said again, same tone, same volume. The smaller drover appeared in the gap where the window had been. "Hank, you all right?" "I will be sending a bill to whoever employs you too," Georgia said. "Get him up and get out." They got him up and got out. Georgia stood in the wreckage of her window, and the cold October air poured through the gap, and she thought, with a flatness that was its own kind of exhaustion, that this was going to cost money she did not have and take time she did not have, and the cold front was going to make tonight particularly unpleasant for the store, because she kept medicinal goods and certain dry goods that could not tolerate freezing temperatures near that window. She was pulling things away from the broken window, stacking them in the center of the store, when Thomas Hudson walked back through the door. He had been at the livery getting Abbott settled and had heard the crash and had, after a moment of internal negotiation, turned back. He was not entirely sure why he turned back. He had learned over the years not to insert himself into other people's situations without invitation, because that was a reliable way to make things worse. But he had noticed the woman in the store with her precise movements and her defended quiet, and something about her had stayed with him in the way that certain things do, not demanding but persistent. He stopped just inside the door and took in the situation. "Windows broken," he observed. Georgia looked at him over her shoulder. "Yes," she said. "I noticed." "I have some boards in my saddlebag," he said. "Scrap wood. I carry it for fires, but some of it's wide enough to cover a window temporarily until you can get glass fitted. It won't be pretty." Georgia straightened up and looked at him, and she did the calculation that she had learned to do quickly and efficiently over the years of running a business alone, which was to assess whether an offer of help was genuine or carried a cost she couldn't afford. He stood there in his duster with his hat in his hand, waiting, and he did not look like a man who was expecting anything. "That would be useful," she said. "Thank you." He went and got the boards and came back and spent the next 40 minutes measuring and nailing them across the window opening with a competence that suggested he had done this kind of repair work before, which he had, because life on the trail involved a continuous series of improvised solutions to unexpected problems. Georgia worked alongside him, not standing back and watching but actually helping, holding boards in place while he nailed them, handing him tools from the small kit he carried. Clara came in from upstairs, where she had been doing her lessons, to investigate the noise. She stood in the doorway between the store and the back storeroom in her wool stockings and her blue dress and looked at the man with the hammer with the frank, unfiltered interest of a 7-year-old. "Who are you?" Clara asked. "Thomas Hudson," he said. "Who are you?" "Clara Winslow." "Why are you fixing our window?" "Because it's broken," he said. Clara considered this. "That's a very simple reason." "Simple reasons are usually the most honest ones," he said. Clara seemed satisfied with this. She came and sat on the end of the counter and watched him work, and Georgia watched her daughter watching the stranger, and felt something she couldn't quite name, something wary and warm in equal measure. When the boards were up, Thomas cleaned up the broken glass from the floor without being asked, sweeping it carefully into a dustpan and depositing it in the trash barrel out back. Then he came back in and looked at the window and said it would hold through the night but she should get glass fitted before the next rain. "I know a glazier in Wichita who does good work," Georgia said. "I'll send a message tomorrow." "There's a man in town who does it too," Thomas said. "Runs the hardware store. He's not as skilled as a proper glazier, but he can get you through a Kansas winter." Georgia didn't know this. She had not known there was anyone in Caldwell who could fit glass. "How do you know that?" "I passed through here in the spring," he said. "Needed a pane fitted on a wagon I was transporting. Fellow's name is Grundy, works out of the back of the hardware." "I'll ask him," Georgia said. There was a brief silence. Thomas put on his hat. "Well," he said, "I hope your evening's quieter than your afternoon." "It usually is," Georgia said. He nodded and started for the door, and Clara said, without particular calculation, just the honest observation of a child, "Mama never talks this long to anybody." Georgia felt the color rise in her face. "Clara." "It's true, though," Clara said. Thomas paused with his hand on the door and looked back, and there was something in his expression, not amusement exactly, but something adjacent to it, a kind of warmth. "Your daughter is a truthful person," he said. "She is," Georgia said. "Occasionally too much so." He went out, the bell rang. Georgia looked at the boarded window and then at Clara, who was completely untroubled by the awkwardness she had created and was swinging her legs off the counter and humming to herself. "Come help me move these goods back," Georgia said. "He was nice," Clara said, hopping off the counter. "He was helpful," Georgia said. "That's a slightly different thing." "Why is it different?" Georgia did not have a good answer to that, so she handed Clara a box of candles and told her to put them on the second shelf. And the conversation moved on the way conversations do, when they've arrived somewhere one person isn't ready to go. Thomas did not leave Caldwell that night, which had not been his original intention. His original intention had been to ride out by late afternoon and make camp south of town before full dark. But by the time he was done with the window, the cold had settled in properly, and Abbott had been pulling at his hay in the livery stall with a focused devotion that suggested the gelding had no interest in going anywhere. And Thomas had looked at the gray sky and the lowering temperature, and made the sensible decision to spend the night at the Caldwell boarding house and leave in the morning. He had supper at the boarding house, a table full of other travelers and a few local men, and he was quiet through most of it in the way he was quiet when he didn't know people well, attentive but not forward. And he ate a decent meal of beef stew and cornbread, and drank 2 cups of coffee, and went to his room and lay on the bed in the dark, and thought about Georgia Winslow with her precise movements and her defended quiet, and the moment when Clara had said, "She never talked that long to anybody." He was not a man who fell quickly or carelessly. He had been in love once, years ago, with a woman in San Antonio who had eventually decided she wanted a life that did not include a man who was gone for months at a time driving cattle from one place to another, which was a reasonable thing to decide, and he had not argued with it. Since then, he had lived the way men who move constantly tend to live, lightly, without accumulation, and he had told himself he was content with that, and most days he was. But most days was not the same as all days, and there were nights on the trail when the fire was small, and the prairie was enormous, and the distance between himself and any particular place or person felt total and absolute, and on those nights the contentment was harder to locate. He was not telling himself, lying in the dark in the Caldwell boarding house, that Georgia Winslow was any particular thing to him. He had spoken to her for perhaps 45 minutes total. He was simply aware that she was a person of substance, the kind that was not common, and that she was living inside something heavy, and that it was not his business, and that he would ride south in the morning. In the morning, he went to the mercantile to buy a 2nd pound of coffee because he had reconsidered his provisions and decided he was undersupplied, and this was mostly true and partly an excuse, and he was honest enough with himself to know it was partly an excuse without being entirely sure what to do about that. Georgia was alone in the store, Clara having been delivered to the schoolhouse 2 streets over. She was behind the counter writing in her ledger, and she looked up when the bell rang, and there was a moment, very brief, when something in her face shifted in a way that might have been surprise or might have been something else, and then the composure returned. "Coffee," he said. "I underestimated my supply." She got the coffee and weighed it and wrapped it, and he paid her and then stood at the counter for a moment, not quite leaving. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "Well enough," she said. "You're still in town." "Leaving this morning," he said. "I wanted to make sure the window held last night." She glanced at the boarded window. "It did, thank you again." "I'll be fine," he said, which was not a response to what she'd said but to something he'd been thinking, and he recognized it immediately as a peculiar thing to say out loud. "I mean, it'll be fine, the boards." Georgia looked at him. There was a very slight, very controlled crinkle at the corners of her eyes that might have been the shadow of something that used to come more easily. "Yes," she said. "I expect they will." He left. He rode 4 miles south of Caldwell, and then he stopped Abbott on a low rise and looked at the flat Kansas landscape spreading out ahead of him, brown grass and pale sky, and the far line of the horizon as straight as a ruled line, and he sat there for a while in the cold morning air, and Abbott swung his big gray head around to look at him with an expression of profound impatience. "I know," Thomas said. He turned Abbott around. He rode back to Caldwell, and he went to see Grundy at the hardware store, and he arranged, out of his own pocket, for Grundy to come and fit a proper glass pane in the mercantile window, and then he went to the mercantile and told Georgia what he'd arranged. Georgia stared at him. "You didn't need to do that." "I know," he said. "I can pay for my own window." "I know that too," he said. "But you shouldn't have to pay for a window that got broken by a drunk drover who wasn't your customer and wasn't your problem. And I was there, and you couldn't very well leave the store to go chase down whoever employs those men. So I handled it." "That is a very long explanation for something that didn't require an explanation," Georgia said. I'm a thorough person, he said. She looked at him steadily for a moment. Are you planning to stay in Caldwell much longer? I had not planned to, he said, but my plans seem to be revising themselves. The job in Texas, she said. It'll keep another week, he said. Tascosa's not going anywhere. Georgia did not know what to do with this information, so she did what she always did when she didn't know what to do with something, which was to set it aside and deal with the immediate practical reality. Would you be willing to do some work? She said. Paid work. I have some repairs I've been meaning to have done and I haven't found anyone reliable. The back porch is rotting in 2 places, and the fence on the east side of the property needs resetting because 3 posts have pulled out of the ground. I can do that, Thomas said. And so it began. Not with declarations or sweeping gestures, but with a porch and a fence, the way most real things begin, with something that needs doing. He started the next day, arriving early in the morning with tools he borrowed from Grundy's Hardware and working through the day with a steady, methodical competence. Georgia brought him coffee mid-morning and then lunch at noon, not because she felt obligated to, but because she was feeding herself and Clara anyway, and adding a 3rd plate was no particular trouble, and because it was the honest thing to do when a person was working hard on your behalf. They ate at the small table on the back porch, the 3 of them in the thin October sunshine, and Clara talked for most of it, in the unstoppable, ranging way of 7-year-olds, covering the topics of her school lessons, the rooster at the livery, a girl in her class named Josephine who had a new doll with real hair, and her theory about where clouds went when the sky was clear, which was that they folded up small and hid behind the mountains, except that there were no mountains in Kansas, so she wasn't sure where they went locally. Thomas listened to all of this with the kind of genuine interest that children can tell is real and adults often can't fake convincingly. He asked questions. He offered his own theory about clouds, which involved the idea that maybe they didn't go anywhere, they just became invisible, which Clara found both unsatisfying and philosophically interesting. What do you know about clouds? Clara asked him, not rudely, just curiously. I've slept under them for about 15 years, he said. I know what they look like from every direction. That's not the same as knowing where they go, Clara pointed out. No, he agreed. It isn't. Georgia ate her lunch and said very little and listened to her daughter and this stranger talk about clouds, and she felt the thing that had been living inside her like a second skeleton shift slightly, as though it were rearranging itself to make room for something. She didn't examine this feeling closely. She was not ready to examine it closely. She simply let it be there. In the afternoons, while Thomas worked, Georgia ran the store, and occasionally one or the other of them would come to where the other was and say something about a practical matter, a question about where she kept extra nails, a report on a customer who had come in asking about something she didn't carry, small communications that built up over the days like the logs of a cabin, one placed on another, each one not significant alone, but together forming something with walls. On the 4th day, Elias Voss came into the store. He was the rancher Thomas had delivered the horses to, a large, prosperous man with a beard the color of iron and the kind of permanent squint that came from years of looking across open land. He bought supplies and then lingered at the counter in the way men linger when they have something they want to say that they're not sure about. I see Hudson's doing work for you, Voss said. He is, Georgia said. Good man, Voss said. I've used him 3 times for horse deliveries. Reliable, honest. Doesn't drink to excess. Georgia continued writing in her ledger. That's reassuring. Not a settled man, Voss added. Moves around quite a bit. Georgia looked up. Mr. Voss, are you warning me about something or recommending him? Voss had the grace to look slightly abashed. Neither, I suppose. Both. He's a good man is all I'm saying. Some women in your situation might be looking for a settled man and he ain't that. I'm not looking for anything, Georgia said pleasantly, except a customer who has completed his purchase. Voss took his supplies and went. That evening Thomas finished the fence and came around to the front of the store to report it done. and Georgia was just turning the sign to closed, and she invited him in for supper again, more naturally this time, without the specific deliberateness of the first time. And he came in and sat at the table while she cooked, and Clara sat across from him and showed him the drawing she had made at school that day, which was a horse, possibly, or a building. The distinction was not entirely clear. "It's a horse," Clara said firmly. "I can see that now," Thomas said. "The legs are very expressive." "What does expressive mean?" "It means they say something," he said. "These legs say the horse is going somewhere important." Clara looked at her drawing with new appreciation. "I did not know that about the legs," she said, "but I think you're right." Georgia, standing at the stove, said nothing, but the corner of her mouth moved, just slightly, just for a moment. She did not know that Thomas saw it because he was looking at Clara's drawing, or appeared to be, but he saw it. Over the following days, the work on the property was done, and Thomas found other reasons to stay. He was honest with himself that they were reasons he was constructing rather than discovering, but the construction felt worthwhile. He helped Grundy at the hardware move some heavy lumber that had come in on a freight wagon, which paid him a small wage and gave him an ongoing reason to be in the area of the mercantile. He took a job exercising horses at the livery, which was simple work that he could do in the mornings and be done before noon. He was building a life in Caldwell the way you build a fire, carefully, with attention to what might last. Georgia watched this without commenting. She was not a woman who pretended not to see things. She saw that he was staying, and she saw why, or thought she did, and the knowledge of it lived in her the way a new piece of furniture lives in a room that has been arranged a certain way for a long time, obviously present, changing the dimensions of the space, requiring adjustment. She was not afraid of him. She had learned to trust her own judgment about people over the years of running the store alone, a skill sharpened by necessity, and her judgment told her that Thomas Hudson was what he appeared to be, which was a decent man with good hands and a patient way of being in the world. What she was, if she was anything, was afraid of herself, of the part of herself that had been very carefully sealed shut, and that she could feel, in these days since he'd arrived, becoming less sealed. Samuel had been gone 3 years. She had loved him truly, the kind of love that builds across years of shared work and shared worry and shared small daily life. His absence was a fact she had made her peace with, or thought she had, or had made something that passed for peace, the functional version of it that allowed her to keep moving. What she had not made peace with, she was beginning to understand, was the idea of ever feeling anything again, which was different. That felt like a betrayal of something, though she could not say precisely what. She found herself, in the evenings after Clara was in bed, sitting at the table with her ledger and thinking about conversations she'd had with Thomas during the day, turning them over the way you turn a stone to look at its underside, looking for the thing in them that kept drawing her attention. He was funny, she realized, in a quiet way that she had not initially registered because she had not been listening for it. He said things that were precise and slightly unexpected, observations that had a little tilt to them, and she found herself noticing when he was about to say something like that, the small pause before it, the particular way his eyes shifted. She had not laughed in a very long time. She was aware of this as a fact about herself, the way she was aware that she had a habit of tapping her pen on the ledger when she was adding figures, something she did without choosing to. Laughter had departed from her life along with Samuel, and she had not looked for it because looking for it had seemed, in the geography of grief, somehow disloyal, as though joy were a country she no longer had a passport to enter. On the 10th day of Thomas Hudson's stay in Caldwell, a Friday, the town had one of those autumn evenings that happen occasionally on the Kansas plains, when the temperature drops just enough to make the air crisp without being cruel, and the sky holds color long past the time it should, a deep orange fading through pink to a purple, so vivid it looks like something painted rather than natural. The main street was alive with the end-of-week energy, drovers and settlers and townspeople all moving through it, and there was music coming from the direction of the Long Branch, a fiddle playing something quick and cheerful. Georgia had closed the store and fed Clara and put her to bed and was sitting on the front step in the last of the evening light, not for any particular reason, just because the air was good and the interior of the building felt small and close, when Thomas came walking down the street and saw her there. He stopped. "Evening," he said. "Evening," she said. He stood there for a moment and then sat down on the step below her, which was a slightly lower level and required him to look back and up to see her face, and he did that, and they looked at the street and the fading sky together. "My father used to say that a Kansas sunset could make a man feel simultaneously grateful and lonesome," Thomas said. "That's an exact description," Georgia said. "He was a precise man." "Where is he now?" "Missouri," Thomas said. "He runs a farm outside Independence." "I go back every few years." Georgia looked at the sky. "Do you ever think about settling somewhere?" "I think about it more lately," he said, and he said it straightforwardly, not as a loaded thing, just as a true statement. Georgia was quiet for a moment. "Voss came into the store," she said. "I know," Thomas said. "He told me he talked to you. He said you're not a settled man." "He's right that I haven't been," Thomas said. "That's not the same as saying I can't be." The fiddle from the Long Branch changed to a slower tune, something old and slightly mournful. Georgia hugged her knees and looked at the orange remnant of the sunset. "Samuel settled here when he was 22, she said. "He loved it. He loved the store and the town and the way things grew here. He said Caldwell felt like a place that was deciding what it was going to be, and he wanted to be part of the deciding." She was quiet for a moment. "He was 26 when he died. He got sick in February and was gone by April. It was a lung fever." Thomas said nothing. He did not offer condolences because he could tell they were not what she was offering this information for. She was not looking for sympathy. She was explaining something. "Clara was 4, Georgia said. "She doesn't remember much of him. She asks me sometimes what he was like, and I tell her, but I'm aware that my telling is all she'll have. That seems very insufficient for a father who loved her the way he did." "What was he like?" Thomas asked. Georgia looked surprised, as though she hadn't expected the question, and then something softened in her. "He was kind," she said. "He was steady. He worried too much about money and not enough about what people thought of him, which is the reverse of how most people are, and I always thought that was one of his best qualities. He could fix almost anything mechanical. He was a poor dancer, but he tried enthusiastically." She paused. "He laughed easily. He could find something funny in most situations. I used to tease him that he'd laugh at a funeral if the coffin were tilted wrong." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry." "Yes," Georgia said simply. "Me too." They sat in the failing light until the orange was gone and the purple had deepened to black, and the stars were beginning to show themselves. And then Georgia said she should go in, and Thomas said good night and walked back down the street. And Georgia sat there a moment longer alone, and held the strange sensation of having told a near stranger something she hadn't said aloud in 3 years, and finding that the world had not ended when she said it. The following week brought 2 things of consequence. The first was a letter from the bank in Wichita, which informed Georgia that the note on the remaining 40 acres was coming due in 60 days, and that she had the option of paying the principal in full or refinancing at terms that were notably less favorable than the original agreement, which was the bank's way of saying they expected payment and would be inconvenienced by alternatives. The second was that Thomas Hudson asked Georgia if she would like to ride out to see the countryside on Sunday after church, him and her and Clara, because he had come across a bend in Elm Creek 3 miles north of town that was remarkable in the fall light, and thought they might enjoy it. The letter she sat with and worried about. The invitation she sat with and worried about for different reasons. In the end, she said yes to the invitation because Clara's face when she heard about a riding excursion was so incandescent with excitement that refusing would have been an act of something close to cruelty. They rode out on Sunday. Georgia on the steady bay mare she kept for herself, and Thomas on Abbott, and Clara on the small pinto pony that lived at the livery, and had a personality of vast self-confidence despite being approximately 12 hands tall. The November air was cold, but the sun was bright and the grass was tawny, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone entirely gold, every leaf burning in the light. The bend in Elm Creek was exactly as Thomas had described it. The creek curved in a wide S, and at the inner bend, there was a sandbar and a cluster of old cottonwoods that cast long shadows, and the water ran clear and swift over smooth stones and made a sound that was both lively and peaceful. Clara immediately abandoned her pony and went to the water's edge and began picking up stones with the focused scientific interest of a child who has discovered a new laboratory. Georgia stood at the edge of the creek and looked at it, and something inside her went very still, not the cold, defended stillness she carried most of the time, but a different kind, the stillness of a person who has been handed something beautiful and is simply receiving it. "It's lovely," she said. "I thought you'd think so," Thomas said. He was standing a few feet from her, and he sounded quietly pleased, and Georgia was aware, without looking at him directly, of how close he was. Clara found a frog at the water's edge and held it up with both hands and shouted that she had found a frog, and Thomas called back that it was an excellent frog, and Clara shouted back that she was going to name it, and Thomas said what was its name, and Clara considered for a very short time and said its name was Cornelius because that was a very dignified name for a frog of this quality. "Cornelius," Thomas said, and he looked at Georgia. "Your daughter has a fine naming sensibility. She named the cat at the store Cardinal despite the fact that it is gray and has never, to my knowledge, shown any interest in Catholicism," Georgia said. Thomas looked at her. His mouth curved. "That's a very reasonable name for a gray cat," he said. "She said the cat had a dignified manner and all the dignified things she knew were called Cardinal something," Georgia said. "She's not wrong," he said. "I know," Georgia said, and the corner of her mouth moved, that slight, controlled motion that was the ghost of something more. And then Thomas said, perfectly casually, looking back at Clara, who was now introducing Cornelius to a second frog she had found and narrating their meeting with great seriousness, "I once named a horse Gerald. Everyone told me it was not an appropriate name for a horse. I told them Gerald had opinions about being called something more dramatic, and I had to respect that." Georgia looked at him. He continued, still looking at Clara and the frogs. "Gerald was a mule, actually. He had corrected me on several important matters, and I felt naming him after a man was the least I could do." Georgia opened her mouth. Something happened in her chest, a sudden upward motion, like something that had been submerged for a very long time breaking the surface of water, and she heard a sound come out of her that she did not immediately recognize because it had been so long since she had heard it from herself. It was a laugh. Not a polite smile or a quiet chuckle, but an actual laugh, genuine and surprised and full, and it came out of her with a force that was almost startling, as though it had been waiting for exactly the right moment and had simply been biding its time. She pressed her hand over her mouth immediately, reflexively, as though she could take it back or contain it, but it was already out, it had already happened, and Thomas had turned to look at her with an expression that was so quietly, deeply pleased that she felt the laughter surge up again and she had to breathe through it. "I'm sorry," she said, though she was laughing again, a smaller version this time. "That was very the mule named Gerald." "He did have opinions," Thomas said, and he was smiling properly now, and it transformed his face into something she hadn't seen in all the days she'd known him, entirely open like a window going up. "What kind of opinions?" Georgia asked, and she was still breathing through the end of the laughter, a kind of delighted unsteadiness. "About the direction of travel, primarily," Thomas said, "and about breakfast. He had strong feelings about breakfast." Georgia laughed again, and this time she let it be what it was, and the sound of it went out across the creek, and the water and the gold cottonwood leaves, and Clara looked up from her frogs and stared at her mother with a pure, wide-eyed wonder, because Clara had never in her remembered life heard her mother laugh like that, not with that sound, and it was the most astonishing thing she had ever heard. "Mama," Clara said, and her voice was very soft. Georgia looked at her daughter. Her eyes had gone bright, and she was not sure if it was the cold air or something else, and she did not examine it. "What is it, sweetheart? You sound pretty when you laugh," Clara said. Georgia could not speak for a moment. Thomas was looking at the creek with great concentration and extreme deliberateness, giving her whatever privacy she needed with this moment, and she loved him for that small grace, just a little, just the beginning of it. "Thank you," she told Clara. "Come, show me your frogs." They spent 2 more hours at the creek. Clara liberated Cornelius and his companion back to the water. Thomas made a fire in the small ring of stones that someone else had built at the bend, probably at some previous time when someone else had discovered this place. And they ate the lunch Georgia had packed, cold biscuits and salt beef and dried apricots, and drank coffee from the small pot Thomas had brought in his saddlebag, and the afternoon was cold and golden and unhurried. On the ride back, Clara fell asleep against Georgia's shoulder, which required some creative arrangement on the saddle but was manageable, and they rode slowly to accommodate her sleeping. Thomas rode alongside Georgia, and the 3 of them moved through the tawny grass in the late afternoon light, and Georgia thought that this was the first Sunday afternoon in 3 years that had felt like something other than a gap between one week and the next. She thought about the laugh at the creek. She turned it over the way she had turned over the conversations, looking at the underside of it. It had come out of her so naturally, so completely without warning or effort, as though it had simply been waiting for the right door, and Thomas Hudson had opened it with a mule named Gerald. The thought made her want to laugh again right now, riding through the grass, and she let herself smile privately into the cold air. In the days that followed, something shifted in the quality of things between them. It was subtle and gradual in the way that genuine things usually are, nothing dramatic or declared, just a change in the texture of the ordinary. Georgia found herself looking forward to the times during the day when Thomas would appear, whether to report on some work he'd completed or simply to come in for supplies or to have the midday meal that had become, without formal arrangement, a daily fixture. She found herself wanting to tell him things, small things, things that happened in the store, things Clara said, things she read in the newspaper that the weekly stage brought from Wichita. And he told her things in return, about the trail, about the places he'd been, about the particular quality of the Texas panhandle at dawn when the sky went from black to the most improbable series of colors over the flat land, about his family in Missouri, about a book he was reading, a novel by a man named Henry James that he had found left behind at a rooming house in Abilene and had been carrying around ever since. "I didn't expect a working cowboy to be reading Henry James," Georgia said one afternoon when he'd mentioned the book in passing. "I didn't expect a mercantile owner to quote Tennyson," he said, which referred to something she had said 3 days before while trying to remember a line, just tossed it out there to see if she could recall the next part. "I wasn't quoting," she said. "I was misremembering." "You were close," he said. "The mist and the silent waste were correct." She looked at him. "How do you know?" "I have a copy," he said. "I'll bring it." He brought it the next day and left it on the counter, a slim, battered volume of In Memoriam that had been read so many times the cover was soft as cloth, and Georgia picked it up that evening and read for an hour by lamplight, and when she found the line she'd been misremembering, she felt a ridiculous warmth at the idea that he'd looked it up for her. She had not felt warmth about a man in 3 years. She sat with the realization and let it be real. The crisis about the banknote came to a head in late November. Georgia had done the numbers 3 times carefully, and they came out the same each time, which was that she could cover the principal payment but only barely and only if the store had a good month in December, which was not certain. Caldwell had grown over the past 2 years, which was good, but the cattle season was winding down and many of the drovers had headed south and the town was quieter, and the income from the store reflected this. She was sitting with the ledger at the back table one morning when Thomas came in for coffee and saw her face and said, "What's wrong?" She almost deflected. She was extremely good at deflecting. She had been deflecting for 3 years with a skill and consistency that had become its own kind of armor. But she was tired of the armor, she realized, tired of its weight, and she told him about the bank note. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment and then said, "What's the shortfall if December is slow?" she told him. It was not a large number, but it was significant enough to matter. He reached into the interior pocket of his coat and put a folded envelope on the table between them. She looked at it and then at him. "What is that?" "Pay I collected from Voss for the horse delivery," he said, "and what Grundy's paid me. And what I saved from the last Texas job. It adds up to something close to what you need as a buffer if December goes wrong." Georgia stared at the envelope and then at him, and her face did a complicated thing. "I'm not going to take your savings. I'm not giving them to you," he said. "I'm investing them." "In what?" He met her eyes steadily. "In the store, in Caldwell, in staying here." He paused. "In whatever this is." The room was very quiet. Outside, the November wind was working on the boards of the boarded side of the building and making its cold comments. Inside, the lamp on the back table made a small, warm circle of light. Georgia looked at him for a long time, and something moved across her face, the full range of it, fear and wanting and grief and the ghost of grief, and something that was coming through the ghost like morning through fog. "Thomas," she said. His name in her mouth felt like a word she'd been working up to saying for a long time. "I know it's fast," he said. I know you're not ready, probably. I know you might never be ready, but I'm not going anywhere. I want you to know that." "Voss said you're not a settled man," she said. "Voss doesn't know what I'm thinking," he said. "I have a daughter," she said. "Clara needs stability. She needs something I can count on." "I know that," he said. "I would not be saying any of this to you if I were not entirely serious about it." "You've known me for 3 weeks," Georgia said. "I know," he said. "But I also know that some things take 3 weeks and some things take 3 years, and the time doesn't determine whether the thing is real." Georgia put her hands flat on the table. She looked at them. Her hands were capable, work-worn, the hands of a woman who did things, and she looked at them the way she sometimes looked at things when she was making a decision, attending to them as though they were separate from her and might offer an opinion. "I don't know how to do this anymore," she said quietly. "I used to know. I knew how to love someone and live alongside them and let them in all the way you have to let someone in when it's real. And then he died and she stopped. I sealed it up, all of it, because it seemed like the safest thing, because Clara needed me to be functioning and not falling apart." "I know," Thomas said. "It's not a small thing I'd be asking you to accept," she said. "A woman who forgot how to laugh. A child who needs a father figure without me making her promises I don't know yet if I can keep. A store that is perpetually 12 months from financial crisis. A house that has 17 things that need repair." "I repaired the fence," he said. "And the porch and the window. 17 minus 3 is 14, which is entirely manageable." She looked up at him and something broke through on her face, something enormous and tender and tentative, the look of a person who has been indoors a very long time and is standing in the doorway and the sunlight is real. "You said something foolish," she said, "about the 14. "I did it on purpose," he said simply. "You have a beautiful laugh and you should use it more." Georgia looked at him for a very long moment, and then, precisely and deliberately, she reached across the table and picked up the envelope and held it. "This is a loan," she said, "and I will pay it back." "As you like," he said, "and I am not making you any promises today," she said. "I'm not asking for any today," he said, "but I am not—" She stopped and began again. "I would not object to you staying in Caldwell if you wanted to stay." "I want to stay," he said. She set the envelope down and opened the ledger and picked up her pen, and there was the familiar tap of the pen against the ledger as she thought. And Thomas saw it and stored it away as one of the specific things he had come to love about her in these 3 weeks. That small tap. December was not a slow month. Whether by fortune or the particular energy that Kansas towns could summon when the weather was cold, and people needed supplies, and Christmas was coming. December was the best month the Winslow Mercantile had seen in over a year. Georgia paid the bank note in full and had enough left over to order a new batch of inventory for the spring. She paid Thomas back the full amount of what he'd put on the table before Christmas, and he accepted it without argument. Christmas in Caldwell in 1879 was modest by the standards of cities further east, but it had its own warmth. People gathered at the church and then at each other's houses, and the town put up a tree on the main street that was not quite centered and slightly lopsided but cheerful. Georgia made a dinner for the three of them, a roast chicken and potatoes and dried apple pie, and Thomas brought a small gift for Clara, a set of watercolor paints that he had ordered from Wichita weeks before and which arrived by the skin of their teeth on the 23rd. And Clara's reaction to them was so immediate and total that she cried a little, which surprised everyone including Clara. "I've never had paints," Clara explained, wiping her eyes with very great dignity. "They're yours now," Thomas said. Clara looked at him with an expression that was very old for a 7-year-old. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. "Or are you going to go back to Texas?" Thomas looked at Georgia. Georgia was looking at her plate with great attention. "I'm staying," he said. Clara nodded once with the air of someone who has received the information she required and considers the matter settled. Then she picked up the paints and went to find paper, and the matter was, apparently, settled. The new year came in with snow. The first serious snow of the season fell on the first day of January, 1880, covering Caldwell in a quiet white that muffled all the town's noise and made even the main street look peaceful. Georgia stood at the store window, the new glass perfectly fitted now, and watched the snow fall in the lamplight and thought about the year that had ended and the year beginning and what she hoped for it. And she was surprised to find that she had hopes, specific and warm, which was something that had been absent from her January thinking for 3 years. Thomas had gotten a job in January with the livery, exercising horses, and helping with the winter work of keeping the animals healthy through the cold months. It kept him in Caldwell reliably and gave him steady income. He had taken a longer-term room at the boarding house and was making it slightly more habitable, acquiring small things, a better lamp, a rug, a shelf for books, the gradual accumulation of a person who is staying somewhere rather than passing through. He and Georgia took longer walks in the evenings, in the cold after Clara was in bed and the store was closed, walking the quiet streets of Caldwell with their breath making small clouds in the dark air. These walks were where they talked most freely, away from the store and its associations, and the daily practicalities of managing a business and raising a child. They talked about everything and nothing, about books they had read and places they had been, and what they believed about things and what they were uncertain about. And in these conversations, Georgia continued the process she had begun at the creek, the process of opening the defended places slowly, not all at once, not without care, but genuinely. He told her about his parents, his father who was precise and his mother who was expansive, and how growing up between them had made him someone who tried to be both. He told her about the years on the trail and what he had loved about them, the freedom and the open country and the particular companionship of men who shared hard work, and what he had eventually grown tired of, the rootlessness, the perpetual passing through, the life that accumulated nothing. She told him about meeting Samuel when she was 19, and how it had not been love immediately, but had grown into it over a year of knowing each other. Practical love, love built from proximity and respect and shared effort. She told him that she had sometimes wondered in the years of grief whether she had loved Samuel enough, whether she had been grateful enough while he was there, which was the particular cruelty that grief sometimes practices, making you doubt the thing you had while it was present. "From what you've described," Thomas said, one evening in February, the two of them walking the east edge of town where the houses thinned out and the darkness was complete above them except for stars, "you loved him exactly as much as you did. Grief doesn't edit the love, it just amplifies the loss." Georgia was quiet for a moment. Where did you learn to say things like that? My mother, he said. She lost her sister when they were both young. She talked about it honestly, which is not what people usually do. Most people don't talk about grief at all, Georgia agreed. They sit across from you and look worried and talk around it. Like it might be contagious, he said. Exactly like that, she said. She stopped walking. They were at the edge of a field, the stubble of last year's grass poking through the snow, and the stars were extraordinary above them, the kind of density you only see far from city light, the Milky Way a great spilled river across the black. I want to tell you something, she said. All right, he said. I am in love with you, she said. She said it the way she said most important things directly, without flinching, looking at him. I don't know exactly when it happened, but it did, and I thought you should know. Thomas looked at her in the starlight, and his face held everything he felt. He was not a man who hid his face, and what it held was a depth of warmth and a relief so large it was almost visible. I have been in love with you, he said, since you said the cat was named Cardinal because she had a dignified manner. Georgia laughed. She did it easily now, without surprise, the way you breathe without thinking about it. It simply came. That was the second week. Yes, he said. That's fast, she said. I know, he said. I am a generally decisive person. She laughed again, and he stepped forward and she let him, and he kissed her in the starlight with the snow-covered field behind them, and it was careful and certain and exactly what it was, the beginning of something that both of them intended to last. The spring of 1880 came in slowly, the way Kansas springs do, reluctantly, with false starts and late frosts, and then suddenly one morning a warmth that was real, and the grass coming through green and the sky going from the flat white of winter to the particular luminous blue of April. Georgia opened the windows of the store for the first time since October, and the air that came through was different, the mineral smell of wet earth and something green and beginning, and she stood in it and felt the season like a permission. Thomas proposed to her on a Saturday in April. He did not do it grandly, which she would not have wanted. He did it in the store, late afternoon, when Clara had gone to play with her friend Josephine, and the street outside was quiet, and the light through the windows was the gold of late day. He had been standing at the counter looking at her over some question about an order she was filling, and then the question was answered and he said, very simply, I want to marry you, Georgia. She set down the order form. I know I don't have a settled life behind me, he said. I know I've been a man who moved from place to place. I know Caldwell was never somewhere I planned to stop, but I plan to stop here. I want to stop here. I want to run this store with you and raise Clara with you and have more children with you, if you're willing, and grow old in this flat, windy, improbable town. I have never wanted anything as specifically as I want this. Georgia looked at him for a moment. She thought about the boarded window and the porch repair and the bend in Elm Creek and the mule named Gerald and the laugh that had broken out of her like something released after a long captivity. She thought about the walks in the cold and the conversations that had gone on after midnight sometimes when they both forgot to be practical, and the way he looked at Clara with a patient, genuine warmth that asked nothing of the child and simply offered everything. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. He laughed then, a sound of pure relief, and came around the counter, and she let him hold her and she held him back, and it felt like the kind of thing that had been there all along, waiting. The way the creek had been there before he showed it to her, simply needing someone to bring her to it. They were married in June of 1880 at the Caldwell church, which was not a large church but held the whole town if the town put its mind to it, and most of the town did. Clara was the flower girl and took the responsibility with enormous seriousness, scattering petals with a precision that suggested she had been practicing. Elias Voss came, which Thomas found quietly satisfying, and Grundy the glazier came with his wife, and all of George's regular customers came, and the preacher performed the ceremony with an earnestness that was touching if slightly prolonged. After, there was a celebration in the church yard, food that half the women in town had contributed, and music from a fiddler who sat up in the corner and played everything from hymns to dancing tunes. And Thomas danced with Georgia in the June evening, with a freedom that was different from the careful man he had been when he first arrived. The freedom of a person who has found the place he belongs and stopped holding himself ready to leave. He was not a good dancer. He was honest about this up front. "I should warn you," he said, as the fiddler struck up something lively. "I already know," she said. "Clara told me she saw you practice in the livery yard with one of the horses." "Abbott has a natural rhythm," Thomas said. "Abbott is a horse," Georgia said. "He doesn't let it limit him," Thomas said. She laughed, right there in the church yard in the June evening, with half of Caldwell watching, and he spun her inelegantly and entirely joyfully, and she went with it. And Clara, watching from the edge of the dancing with a piece of cake in each hand, one for each occasion, observed her mother's laughing face with an expression that was the most uncomplicated happiness a child can feel. They settled into the life of it with a naturalness that surprised Georgia, though she supposed she should not have been surprised, because she and Thomas had already been building the life for months before the ceremony made it official. Thomas took on the management of the store's supply orders and delivery arrangements, which freed Georgia to focus on the customer relations and the bookkeeping, which were the things she did best. He was good with numbers, better than he had initially let on, and he had ideas about the business, not dramatic revolutionary ideas but sensible ones. Things like establishing a relationship with a supplier in Kansas City who could get them goods faster than the Wichita supplier, and setting up a credit arrangement for the homesteaders who came through and were sometimes short of cash but reliable in their eventual payment. The business grew. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, the way healthy things grow. By the end of 1880, the mercantile was doing better than it had done in Samuel's father's time. Georgia paid off the last of the outstanding debts and felt, for the first time since Samuel died, that the ground beneath her feet was genuinely solid. Clara bloomed. She had been a happy child before Thomas, but happiness without a father figure had a particular quality, sufficient but incomplete, like a sentence without its final word. With Thomas, she was completed in some way that she could not have articulated at 7 years old, but felt as fully as she felt the son. He helped her with her lessons. He taught her to ride properly, not just to sit on the pinto pony, but to actually ride, with attention to the horse's needs and communication, and the relationship between a rider and an animal. He listened to her theories about clouds and frogs and the names of things, listened with the full attention that children know is real. He told her stories in the evenings, stories about the trail and the places he'd been, edited for a child's ears but genuine in their texture, full of real landscapes and real weathers. He adopted her formally in the autumn of 1880, with Clara's enthusiastic participation, and a legal proceeding in the Caldwell courthouse that was about as unromantic as legal proceedings always are but felt, to all three of them, like the formal name being given to something that had been true for a long time. Clara Winslow became Clara Hudson. She had opinions about this for approximately one afternoon, and then decided she liked it very much. In the spring of 1881, Georgia told Thomas she was expecting. She told him at breakfast, which was a domestic, ordinary moment, the two of them at the kitchen table with coffee and the morning coming through the window, and she said it simply, watching his face. His face did the extraordinary open thing, the window going up. He put down his coffee cup. He looked at her. He said with a rawness that was not performed, "I did not know I wanted something this specifically until right now." "You wanted children," she said. "I wanted your children," he said. "There's a difference." She crossed the kitchen and he stood up, and she held his face in both hands and kissed him in the morning light. And it was a different kind of kiss from the starlight one, older and warmer, and full of the specific weight of shared time. The baby was born in November of 1881, a boy, which Thomas received with a delight he did not bother to contain, a healthy boy with dark hair and George's green eyes, and they named him Samuel Thomas Hudson. Samuel for the man who had loved Georgia first and whose ghost they had made room for in their life, because that was the honest and right thing to do, and Thomas because this baby was the beginning of something new. Clara was 8 when her brother arrived, and she received him with the ferocious protectiveness that older sisters often discover they possess the moment the smaller creature is placed in their arms. She held him with extreme care and looked at his face with an expression of total seriousness. "He looks like a frog," she informed Thomas. "He does a little," Thomas agreed. "I will not name him Cornelius," Clara said. "That name belongs to the frog. It would be confusing." "I think Samuel is a good name," Thomas said. "Samuel," Clara said, testing it on her tongue, studying the baby's face. "Yes, he looks like a Samuel. He has a Samuel kind of expression." "What does a Samuel kind of expression look like?" Georgia asked from the bed, tired and warm and entirely present. "Serious," Clara said, "but like he might laugh." Georgia looked at her daughter holding her son and felt something so large and full she had no name for it. Something that was made of grief and love and time, and the way things end and the way they begin. All of it compacted into this moment, this room, this particular November afternoon with the Kansas wind outside and her family inside. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed beside her and she leaned against him, and they watched Clara introduce herself formally to Samuel, explaining who she was and what he could expect from her, which was protection, guidance in the naming of animals, and the best watercolor paintings he would ever see, all of which she delivered with the gravity of a major contractual obligation. "Thank you," Georgia said quietly. Thomas looked at her. "For what specifically?" "For coming back," she said. "That second day. When you turned around." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad I did." "So am I," she said. She looked at Clara and the baby. "So very much." The years that followed had the texture of a life lived forward, which is to say they had difficulty and abundance and loss and joy in the proportions that real lives have. The winter of 1882 was brutal, one of the harshest Kansas had seen in a decade, and it tested the store and the town and every family in it. Thomas and 2 other men from Caldwell went out in a February blizzard to help a homesteading family whose farm was 10 miles east of town, a family with 3 small children and an inadequate wood supply. And Georgia spent those 2 days by herself in the store with Clara and the baby Samuel, and a fear for Thomas that was specific and physical and reminded her, uncomfortably but honestly, of what love costs in a world where weather is real and danger is real, and nothing is guaranteed. He came back. Of course he came back. He came in covered in snow and nearly frozen, and sat by the stove for 2 hours drinking coffee and thawing, and Georgia sat across from him and did not say a single thing about being afraid, and he did not say a single thing about knowing she had been afraid, and they understood each other completely. The homesteading family survived the winter, and eventually their land came good, and they were people the Hudsons knew for the rest of their lives, the Morrows, who had a daughter Clara's age named Ruth, and who became the kind of family friends that children think of as almost kin. In the spring of 1883, Georgia and Thomas expanded the mercantile into the building next door, which had stood empty since its previous tenant, a barber, had moved to Wichita. They knocked through the shared wall and extended the store, and Thomas built new shelving from lumber they brought in from Wichita, and the expanded store became one of the best-stocked mercantiles on the southern Kansas route. Freighters stopped there on their way south. Homesteaders came from 20 miles away. Georgia hired a young woman named Annette to help during the busy seasons, a recent arrival in Caldwell who was quick with numbers and had a natural ease with customers. They had a second child in the summer of 1884, a girl this time, and they named her Elena Rose, and she came into the world with a set of opinions that she expressed loudly from the first moments of her life. And Thomas said this was a promising sign of character, and Georgia said yes, but perhaps she could develop her character at a slightly lower volume, and Thomas laughed, and Georgia laughed. And upstairs, Clara held a 2-year-old Samuel on her knee and told him that he had a sister now, and this was going to be very interesting. The injustices of the era touched their lives as they touched everyone's in Caldwell. The Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples who had once moved freely across the land that was now Kansas territory lived increasingly constrained lives on reservations to the south and west. And Thomas had seen enough of the West to understand that the range and freedom he had himself experienced on the trail had come at a cost borne by people who had not chosen to pay it. He talked about this with Georgia in the evenings sometimes, not with the easy righteousness of someone who lived untouched by it, but with the honest discomfort of someone who was part of a system he had not designed but benefited from. They gave fair prices to the Comanche traders who occasionally came through Caldwell, and Georgia extended the same credit terms to homesteaders regardless of their origin, which in a border town meant some of her customers were people whose families had come from places and circumstances very different from the eastern settlers who made up most of Caldwell. She did not make a proclamation of this. She simply did it. Thomas had noticed early on, and it was one of the things that had confirmed for him what kind of person she was. Clara grew up with the questioning intelligence she had always had, and she became, by her teenage years, a young woman of formidable capability and a stubbornly independent mind, which caused Georgia and Thomas both pride and occasional exasperation in roughly equal measure. She was a gifted painter, the watercolors giving way to oils when she was 12, and her paintings of the Kansas landscape had a quality that was hard to describe precisely, but that people always stopped in front of when she hung them on the store wall. She also remained, throughout her childhood and adolescence, entirely certain about the importance of naming things properly. The livestock around the Hudson property at various times included a dog named Archbishop, a cat named the Right Honorable Biscuit, and a horse named Thaddeus, whom Thomas privately thought had the most reasonable name of any horse he had ever encountered. Samuel grew into a boy of considerable good humor and practical intelligence, more interested in the mechanics of things than in their names, which made him Thomas's natural partner in every repair and construction project around the property. By the time he was 8, he had helped Thomas rebuild the back fence properly and lay a new floor in the storeroom, and repair the chimney that had been leaning slightly since the previous winter's freeze. He was Clara's opposite in many ways and her complement in others, and the two of them together were a complete argument for the proposition that children from the same family could be entirely different people. Alina, who was her own thing entirely, was interested primarily in people, and in understanding what made them behave as they did, which at 5 was expressed as an unnerving habit of staring at strangers, until she felt she had understood them, and at 10 as an ability to mediate arguments between Clara and Samuel, with a fairness that left both parties feeling slightly managed but not resentful. Georgia, in the middle of these years, found something she had not expected to find, which was a version of happiness that was not the absence of grief, but the genuine presence of joy distinct from it, its own thing. Samuel Winslow's ghost was present in their house in the way good ghosts are, in the name of her son, and in the stories she told about him to all 3 of her children, so they would know the man who had been the first chapter of her life, honored and present without being a weight. Thomas never asked her not to talk about Samuel, and never made a face when she did, which was one of the things she loved most specifically about him. She laughed easily now. The sealed-up place had been open for so long that she had nearly forgotten it had ever been closed. She laughed at Clara's ongoing pronouncements about dignity and naming. She laughed at Samuel's deadpan observations about the structural integrity of things. She laughed at Alina's frank assessments of every person she met. She laughed with Thomas in the evenings, at dinner, on the walks they still took through Caldwell streets, which were more streets now and more lighted than they had been in 1879, the town having decided what it was going to be and committed to it. She laughed at him specifically, at his ongoing commentary on the personalities of animals, which had begun with the mule named Gerald and had never stopped. Every horse he encountered had an inner life he was ready to discuss. Every dog was a full character. The Right Honorable Biscuit the cat he held lengthy one-sided conversations with and reported the results to Georgia with complete seriousness, which made her laugh every time without fail. In 1887, Elias Voss died of a heart failure, which saddened Thomas genuinely, because whatever Voss had thought of him in the beginning, the man had been a reliable presence in Caldwell and had given Thomas his first honest assessment in the area, which was that he was a good man. They went to the funeral, and Thomas was a pallbearer, and Georgia stood beside him through the graveside service, and held his arm and he held hers back, and this was the shape of what they had, in all its dimensions, the public and private, the easy and the hard. Clara married in 1895, when she was 23, a schoolteacher named David Holt, who had come to Caldwell 2 years earlier, and who had recognized immediately that Clara Winslow Hudson was the most remarkable person he had ever met, and he was entirely right about this. The wedding was at the same church where Georgia and Thomas had married, and Georgia wore blue and Thomas was the proudest man in Kansas, and Clara came down the aisle with the watercolor paintings of the landscape on the church walls, because she had insisted on them being there, and nobody had argued with her. Samuel went east to study engineering in 1898, which was both a loss and a great pride, and he came back to Caldwell afterward, and eventually built his practice there, because he was his mother's son in that he understood that you could love a place with specific attachment. He married a woman named Vera, who was practical and warm and entirely unintimidated by the Hudson family's particular intensity, which qualified her admirably. Eleanor, most surprising of all, became a doctor, which in 1900 required a stubbornness and determination that she had been building up her entire life. She studied in Kansas City, and then in Chicago, and came back again to Caldwell, where she opened a practice and was the town's only physician for many years, and was absolutely essential to the community in ways that she navigated with the same frank, unnerving clarity she had always brought to understanding people. Thomas and Georgia grew old in Caldwell together in the way that the best marriages age, not by becoming less, but by becoming more fully what they always were. The store passed through various configurations over the years, eventually taken over by Samuel's wife Vera, who had a gift for it, while Thomas and Georgia moved into a more advisory capacity that suited the stage of life they had reached. In the winter of 1902, when Georgia was 51 and Thomas was 54, they sat together on the back porch of their house on the evening of their 22nd anniversary. The porch was solid. Thomas had rebuilt it twice over the years, and the Kansas winter was mild that year by Kansas standards, merely cold rather than brutal, and they had blankets and coffee and the particular quality of two people who have been in each other's company for 22 years and have arrived at a kind of mutual understanding that is its own quiet warmth. Inside the house, which was rarely quiet and was not quiet now, Clara and David were visiting with their 3 children, and Samuel and Vera were there with their new baby, a boy named James who had arrived 3 months ago and was currently being held by Eleanor with the focused interest of a physician assessing a healthy specimen. The sound of the family came through the window, voices and children's feet and Clara's laugh and the baby's small sounds. Thomas poured more coffee. The lamplight from the window made a yellow rectangle on the snow of the backyard. 22 years, Georgia said. Are you counting? He said. I always count, she said. I'm a bookkeeper. He smiled at the night. She could see it in profile, the way she knew all his profiles now, the particular shape of his face in all its lights. Do you remember, she said, the mule named Gerald? I think about Gerald frequently, he said. You said something foolish on purpose, she said. That day at the creek I could tell. Yes, he said. You wanted to make me laugh, she said. "You had not laughed in a very long time," he said. "I noticed." She looked at him in the lamplight coming through the window. "You noticed a lot of things. You are very worth noticing," he said. She laughed now quietly in the cold air because he had said it so simply and so completely without decoration, the way he said everything that mattered, and the laugh made a small cloud in the cold and disappeared. "Thomas," she said. "Yes. I am so glad you turned around," she said. "That second day, when you came back." He looked at her, and everything he had ever felt about her was in his face, all 22 years of it. The creek and the starlight and the mornings and the evenings and the children and the store and the porch repairs and the walks and the conversations, and every laugh he had managed to draw out of her in the years since the first one, all of it. "So am I," he said. "Georgia." "So am I." They sat on the porch in the cold evening with their coffee and their blankets, and the lamplight through the window, and the sound of their family from inside. And the Kansas winter stars came out above them. The same stars they had stood under when she first told him she loved him. The same Milky Way river across the black. And neither of them needed to say anything more because everything had been said, and everything was present, and the life they had built together was real and solid, and full in every way that a life can be full. Eventually, Clara called out the window that supper was on the table and they should come in before it got cold. And Alina called that she had opinions about people eating supper in sub-zero temperatures that she was prepared to express professionally. And Samuel said he had already calculated the heat loss from the back door being left open, and it was significant. And Clara's youngest child appeared at the window and simply stared at them until Thomas laughed and Georgia laughed, and they gathered their blankets and went inside. The kitchen was warm and full and loud and completely alive, and Georgia Winslow Hudson stood in the middle of it and let it be exactly what it was: the noise and the love and the children and the grandchildren, and the man across the room who had turned around when he didn't have to and come back. And she felt the fullness of it in her chest. Not the absence of a second skeleton, but the presence of something that had grown in the place where the grief had been. Something green and lasting, and entirely her own. She laughed at something Clara said. She laughed at something Thomas did with the baby. She laughed through supper, and through the clearing up, and through the evening when the grandchildren were put to bed, and the adults sat with their coffee and their conversation around the warm kitchen table. And it was the easiest thing in the world, as easy as breathing, as natural as the Kansas sky opening blue after a winter that has finally decided to end. Outside, the stars continued their business above Caldwell, Kansas, and the flat land stretched in every direction as it always had and always would, patient and enormous and indifferent to individual lives. And yet down below, in one particular lit window of one particular house on the edge of one particular cattle town, something particular and irreplaceable was happening. Something that had begun with a broken window and a mule named Gerald, and a laugh that broke through 3 years of silence like water breaking through ice. And it was not remarkable by the standards of history, but by the standards of the people living it, by the standards of what it meant to have been closed and to open, to have been finished, and to find that you were not, to have stopped laughing, and then, because a foolish and deliberate and tender-hearted cowboy said exactly the right foolish thing, to start again, and to never, ever stop.